Welcome to the Sub 1000 Recruitment Podcast. With so much of the recruitment industry conversation aimed at big enterprise talent acquisition teams, we decided recruiters at smaller everyday organizations need to be heard. In 2023, we launched our free-to-join Sub 1000 online community. We have thousands of in-house recruiters and HR professionals from everyday organizations who recruit less than 1,000 staff a year, in some cases less than 100. And if you are listening to this, you've probably guessed the next bit. We've also launched a podcast to hear direct from those recruiters. Their stories, insights and experiences about how they get the job done on a limited budget with limited support in either a small team or perhaps completely on their own. Tune in every fortnight to hear from your direct peers. And if you want to get involved, join our free online community at sub1000.com.
Hi everyone, welcome to another podcast episode of the Sub 1000 Community. Today we're joined with Benjamin Black, who is an experienced senior HR leader. Hi Ben.
I'm good, how are you?
Perfect. So Benjamin, we start every podcast with the first two questions.
Okay.
Tell me, how did you first get into HR, and just share a little bit of your experiences to date.
Okay. I started actually as a management consultant on a graduate scheme that happened to get HR related projects. It wasn't a deliberate career choice. I have an English degree. And then following that, I ended up working in HR for Shell, the oil company, in an HR business partner role, which kind of took me through my career as the asset I worked on was sold to another company. Then that followed through as the assets I worked with Shell was sold to another company, and I stayed on with a very small HR team in a very old established site to do separate the business. And then a few years later, I decided to go out on my own. So I worked as a contractor for about 5 years, doing various different projects in both in banking. I worked in heavy industry. I did some smaller family businesses, or in this more generalist capacity with quite a bit of M&A activity. And then a few years ago, I made a decision to go back into permanent work and moved over to Gibraltar to work for the parent company of Ladbrokes, which is an alcohol chain. I was with them until January this year. And in HR generalist capacity, I looked after all their customer operations people and then all their global tech people.
We're going to lead off today's Sub 1000 podcast with a question around how can in-house HR teams or in-house talent teams add more value to the business and the company through limited resources. Some of the functions are quite small, quite stretched. So what advice, guidance, experiences you have around that value add?
My view is really simple on this. Obviously, there has to be some basics and the groundwork in place. And I think most HR departments are pretty good at making sure that things are compliant and that the rule book is followed, but that's not added value. That's just the basics. People need to get paid. That gets sorted. People, if there's a problem, they need to have a mechanism for dealing with it. People need employment contracts and so on and so forth. However, I think where value can be added, and it doesn't take a lot of work or resources, is by listening. I think a lot of the time it's very easy in HR to follow a textbook to say, this is what the CIPD taught me, or this is what I think we need to be doing, and without considering what is it the business really needs. And I think it's about HR adds value when it builds credibility. And credibility can only be achieved if you're working with the business rather than against it. So it's absolutely fine to advise, push back, challenge, but ultimately understanding the business and how it works, understanding the environment, understanding small b politics as well is really important, but understanding what it is people do on a daily basis, because often, if you're in a tech company, for instance, the mentality of the people you're working with is going to be very different if you're working in, for example, a creative company. So you have to be very mindful of who you're dealing with and then make decisions accordingly and collaboratively. It's much easier in a smaller business to be collaborative. But even in a large business, there's lots of ways you can think about what does this business actually need and want, not just what as HR do we think we should do.
And just staying on that subject for a little bit longer, Benjamin, is there an example that springs to mind where that you either in your more senior career or maybe Benjamin, in the middle of the field, when you've led a team, is there any kind of examples or maybe coaching that you've done or can give to instill confidence in people how to be curious, how to business plan?
Yeah, it's actually about, most people love talking about their jobs, and what I've told my team, and I've told my team this in different companies, is go out, talk to people. If you're meeting, for example, if you're meeting somebody, a manager, because you're doing a disciplinary with them, especially if you're more junior and your contact is to some of the more employee relations and transactional side, use that opportunity to build a bigger relationship. So you might sit with that manager, do the disciplinary hearing, and then, as part of the side conversations, talk to that manager and say, can you give me half an hour so I understand what you and your team really, really do? Or, questions that come out of that case. That's one example of where something that's relatively, you can elevate something from being a relatively transactional HR matter into something much more, much bigger. So I think that's one example I would give, where I say to people, please think bigger. Think about talking to people. Nobody is going to say, no, I'm not going to tell you about my job. People love talking about their jobs. The other thing I think is really important is think about context. So again, if somebody is very used to doing something a certain way, and I'll give an example of this. I had somebody who was covering someone in another country and was asked to do something, and came back and said, well, I've tried to do this, it's not worked. And I said, well, of course it's not worked, because you've applied the UK principles to an Austrian case, for example. And not only is employment law different, but the dynamic's different. There's a lot of different nuances, although it's one company and there's consistencies. But really think about what you're doing in the context of it, rather than just steaming ahead. And I'd say the opposite, it's about a fine art, because I've also seen it where people are paralyzed by data and won't move until they've got all the data. And you can't work in that way either. It's just about being able to appreciate the bigger picture and taking a little time just to check before you leap in and do something, about how you're approaching it, how you're approaching the people you're working with, and making every opportunity to make connections with the business people, understand their challenges, their frustrations. It helps us be better HR people if we do that.
When we think about HR function or in-house talent functions as a whole, obviously there's lots of different processes, lots of different workflows going on, lots of different tasks being done the practice and the reactive. How would you look at streamlining those processes and perhaps understanding how to manage what needs to be delivered urgently and perhaps what from ways?
I think there's no silver bullet answer to that. I think it depends on the business. It depends, because there are instances where something is a priority because there's a risk to the business, but they're not seeing it that way. So a lot of the time it is about seeing what are the risks. If you're really getting into quite, I guess, basic processes versus added value, at some point it's what are the risks? I think as the business matures more, the basic process, you should be setting up your basic process to take care of themselves. It's HR. If you're an HR professional whose first thought is around the process, around doing everything in a standard way, following a rule book, the minutiae, you're an HR professional, but you're an HR officer, you're an administrator. You're not an HR professional, you are an HR worker. And if you want to elevate your career beyond the status as an HR worker, you've just got to keep thinking about what are the real priorities? What's the justification for doing what I'm doing? If not following a process is going to create a legal risk, it's then about saying what the appetite, because being completely risk averse isn't always the right thing for a company. The amount of time you can spend making sure there's no risk, it could actually be disproportionate to the level of risk you face. At a very simple, monetary terms, doing something to protect a business from a potential case from an employee might cost more in the long term than allowing an employee to take the case and then agreeing, some sort of settlement, and time is also money. I think a lot of HR professionals sometimes forget time is money, and how long are you spending on a task in relation to not only the risk, but the value add that the task brings. I'll give an example from my own early career. I remember in one of my first jobs, I was working on an industrial site. Most people have been there for a very long time. And I realized because they'd all been there for so many years, all their contracts were out of date. Some of them had updated versions. Some people hadn't if they never moved jobs. And I got it into my head that I had to create new contracts for everybody, and spent a long time researching, like, where are the differences, highlighting them, creating a new contract template, checking with any legal risks if somebody saw their contract that they don't have certain rights that were in it originally. And actually, at that point, what the business really needed was HR involved with business continuity planning, and I wasn't there. I was too busy thinking about these contracts, which nobody had asked me to do, and it wasn't really going to add any value. It was just basically tidying something up that wasn't really that important. Yes, in an ideal world, you'd have the time to do it, but it wasn't the most important thing to be focusing on at that point. And I think I learned at that point that, I just sort of spent a lot of time really doing, being in a more HR academic environment, and doing a lot of learning because I was quite new to the profession, and realizing actually that I was applying theory without thinking about the pragmatics. So now I feel I'm always really pragmatic, because that actually, I ended up having a conversation with my manager and the main stakeholders that this wasn't really necessary work, and we'd rather you hadn't wasted your time with it.
The HR and talent teams often have to work with various different levels of the business. Sometimes it's PHP, sometimes, or often it's been what level you're in the business, could be working with people who are a lot senior with you in those organizations. How do you manage upwards or influence upwards where some perhaps not giving you the support you need, or perhaps not giving you the answer and not agreeing with the process, then you feel it's integral to help things?
This is like one of those competency-based interviews, isn't it? Let me have a think about this. I think a few of the answers I've given, I'm quite situational focused. So different stakeholders and different people managing upwards are very different. Sometimes it's an absolute dream. You have a leader who just wants to hear what you've got to say, wants to put you at the table. You don't have to do a lot of that work because it just happens automatically, and they're open to be challenged, and you develop a rapport. A lot of the time that isn't the case, but then it's about working out how can you manage that individual? In some cases, is it about building a really strong relationship with their team? Because if you build a strong relationship with the people who work for them, you'll gradually sort of almost seep in as part of the team. And then before you know it, they actually do respect you because you've kind of gone in by the back door, so to speak. In other cases, it might just be that the individual just really value HR. And in that case, it's about showing your worth. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier. The best way to manage upwards is really to ask a lot of questions. It's okay to be a bit humble. It's okay to say, can you explain how this department works? Can you explain the team? Can you explain the history? People like to feel they're being listened to. So I always say, if when you first get a new senior stakeholder and people you've got to manage upwards, it's about really listening to what they have to say and learning from them, even if they are, and it doesn't mean they're going to be right all the time, but if they feel listened to and you're not a bulldozer, you'll generally be fine. I think sometimes managing upwards can be more difficult if you're dealing with people you don't often know or don't often get to know, and then you've got to kind of get to a conclusion quite quickly. And I think then it's also about, there is a reputational issue there. If you can manage your immediate upward stakeholders well, it gives you the confidence to manage anybody well. And I never think it's a good idea to be intimidated.
So ED&I is a really hot topic across any HR talent, and at the moment, probably is going to stay on the agenda for a long time, and it's probably going to be the case. But often the HR and the talent teams are often perhaps given the responsibility of driving and being responsible for making a lot of these changes and a lot of these improvements, when it actually is a business change that needs to happen. So what experience or perhaps guidance or recommendations can you give to these HR and talent teams who are being tasked with driving these ED&I changes or initiatives in the business to get more cross-functional buying, more diverse and inclusive solutions presented and kind of driven?
I think it's often about the results of initiatives so far, because people often don't conscious about some of the stuff that's come before. So I think a part of it is about using what's come before and using that as a showcase. But it's also about, what does D&I, ED&I mean? Is it HR managing spreadsheets with everybody's race and ethnicity? Is it talent managing, candidate questionnaires and attracting talent from certain different sources, or even occasionally having a short list that are racially or ethnically whatever skewed in some way? And I don't actually think that's ever the right thing. I think it's almost tokenistic. I think what matters is you've got to look at, what does the organization value? What sits at the top of the organization? Where do leaders lead by example or not lead by example? And work from the top down in terms of creating a culture within an organization that's one of inclusion and belonging. And if you have an inclusive organization where people feel that they belong, where people feel they have a voice, there's an element of, are people of different ethnicities, religions, sexual and gender identities, are they comfortable there? That should be a conclusive yes. But then also, there's an element of, how hierarchical is your organization? Do the people who are officially the bottom of the hierarchy feel included? Do they feel we're part of a team? And if people are doing meaningful work and feel like they're part of a team where they have a voice, they will naturally feel included. So I think a lot of the time HR's tasked with it, because it's considered to be a bit of a tick box exercise. Let's have a nice seminar on the importance. So D&I, let's celebrate Pride Month, let's celebrate Black History Month, whatever else it might be. Managing, they say in a large company, they might have networks, the disability network, the religion networks, blah, blah, blah. Managing those, administering those, giving people a space. But actually, that can all be happening, but the company itself could still be a really uninclusive, relatively toxic environment. So I'd flip it on its head almost and say, it don't necessarily need to have all that stuff. You obviously, want to make sure you would like to be hiring anybody. You're not looking to target one thing, but if you have an inclusive, flexible, meaningful culture, you're naturally going to become an employer that people want to work for, which will in turn be a diverse employer. If, for example, you have an employer, that is very set in, you come to the office, this is how you work. We don't have, I'm going to be quite dramatic here, we don't tolerate crybabies, keep your personal stuff at the door. You're going to get one sort of person with one sort of mindset there. Even if you've got all the DE&I initiatives in the world, if that's your culture, you're not going to get people who need to work flexibly to take care of their children, or who didn't go to a certain type of school, or whatever it might be. So I'd put all the labels to one side and concentrate on being an inclusive, belonging organization. And as I say, I think for me, that starts with making sure people have meaningful work and know what they're doing and know where they stand and know very quickly if they're doing a good job or whether they need to improve. And I think the concepts that people are talking about at the moment is psychological safety. And I see that as all wrapped up in this sense of inclusion and belonging.
Benjamin, could you share an example of where you had the benefit of working with a diverse team and maybe what were some of those outcomes?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about diversity of culture. I'm talking about diversity of thought, diversity of approach. So on a project I did quite recently, I was working with a global team, people in Manila, India, all over Europe, the US, and the UK, to build something around career pathways and career mentoring and helping people develop. And with the firstly cross-cultural approach, combined with, it wasn't just HR. We had some HR people in the room, we had a couple of talent people in the room, but we also had techies, product designers, user experience and creative people. And by bringing in all these different mindsets, we created a really great product that could be sort of applied cross-culturally in any of our countries, but would also meet the different expectations of the different mindsets that we had within the business. So it was both, we created something that was text-based, but we also had a visual to it. So people who are more visually inclined versus people who are more textually inclined, were able to could take from it what they wanted. We had people who were tech experts, so it could be interactive and fun. I think for myself, if it'd just been designed by HR people, it would have been really, really boring. So, it might not necessarily be a project that you'd think a techie or creative would get involved with other than maybe providing the data. But we did it as a collaborative exercise, and it was something that got created that was really, really good. And not only did it look good, it was meaningful because we consulted the people who actually were going to be using it. So I think that's where I can talk about that. And I think if I look at more of the kind of different cultural nuances, again, we learn a lot about how do managers in different countries, how do they manage their people? How do they give performance feedback? What do we need to be aware of might be easier, let's say, much more free flowing in the UK than say in India. How do you balance that and make sure managers in different countries are equipped to have these conversations in a way that's culturally comfortable?
So we've reached the end of another Simple Thousand podcast today. So Benjamin, we really thank you for your time today. It's been really awesome.
Thank you.
Benjamin is also a member of the Simple Thousand community. So if you want to get into more detail about any of the topics that Benjamin's discussed in the channel today, then by all means, feel free to reach out and connect directly with Benjamin in Benjamin Food. Brilliant. Thanks again for your time, Benjamin.
Thank you.